In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Vray proxy. You can either import or export a proxy from the toolbar here. To export a proxy, simply take the Select tool and click on a piece of geometry in your model. Then, click on this button here for Export Proxy. It will ask you to name a VR mesh. I'm just going to call this Test and save it somewhere. It'll ask you if you want to replace the selection. It's not necessary for the rest of this lesson to choose yes. I'll go ahead and do so just to show you that it will update a few things visually based off the fact that it's now a proxy. I'll go ahead and undo back before I did that, just so we're back to this model. So what's the benefit of a proxy? Well, a proxy is a collection of geometry that is not actually present in SketchUp. SketchUp doesn't need to use its memory and resources to calculate things about it. It's only loaded at render time. And so Vray can render things with millions of polygons, which means that you can render things that are perhaps more complex geometrically than SketchUp can handle. Let's go ahead and import some proxies here. To import a proxy, click on the button here for Import Proxy. Then navigate to the Assets folder, and in there's a proxy folder. We're going to add some trees, so go ahead and click the tree.vrmesh and click Open. This is a file that was saved as a proxy, and what we can do is with a single click, we can place an instance of that proxy and go ahead and place a few instances of this proxy around your model. You can continue to click, and when you're all done, hit the Escape key on your keyboard. Even after you've placed the proxies, you can still manipulate them. For one, you can take the Move tool and move their placement. Also, two, you can rotate it if you want to make it look a little bit different than the others. Or you can also take the Scale tool and scale it up or scale some others down. So go ahead and make a few changes to your proxies just to get them to look a little bit varied. Next, we'll add another proxy, the bush.vrmesh. Click Open. Let's add a few back to this area here. And again, when you're all done, you can hit Escape. Finally, let's add some flower pots to the front. So click on the Import Proxy icon, click on the flower pot, and click Open. And we'll put one on each side of the front door. You can see what proxies you have in your model by going to the Vray Asset Editor, clicking on the Geometry tab here, and you'll see the proxies that you've just put in. If you click on the flyout, you'll notice that those proxies are linked to the underlying file. If at any time you need to reconnect that, simply click on the link here and find the appropriate proxy. For now, go ahead and close the Asset Editor, and I'll click back at the Render Camera scene to see what I've done. Next, we're going to take a look at fur, where we were just able to use proxies to load hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of polygons only at render time. With fur, we also load really complex geometry at render time. Fur can be used for many different things. In this case, we're going to use it for the grass. So with your Select tool, click once on the grass mesh. Then here in the toolbar, click on the fur icon. Next, let's go to the Asset Editor. And you'll notice in the Geometry tab that we now have fur in our model. Go ahead and click on this arrow to roll it out. And we have some parameters here that we're going to play with. To do that, first let's zoom in and get a closer look at the grass area of the model. And then we'll also need to start an interactive render. You can see that where the grass looked flat in SketchUp, the V-Ray fur is allowing it to stand up and make it look like it's been geometrically modeled. So let's take a closer look at some of the settings of this fur. First, let's draw a region around a small portion of this so that our changes that we're about to make happen a bit faster. And I'll move this over just a bit so I can see back to my asset editor. Now, in the basic parameters here, we have all sorts of things that you can play around with. The length is going to be for the total length of the fur strands. Let's set that to 7. The thickness, again, you can play around, but we'll set that to 0.035. And at the bend, I'll set that to 0.12. Now, these basic parameters control every strand of fur, or grass in this case. We can add more realism through the Variance tab here. Click on that. With the direction variance, for example, a value of 1 would have every strand of grass pointing in a different direction, whereas a value of 0 would have every strand of grass pointing in the same direction. We can vary the length of each strand. Let's go ahead and change this value to 0.2. And again, you're welcome to play with any of these. One more option to take a look at here is distribution. We have 2 types of distribution. If you flip down this menu, you have per face or per area. If you select per face, V-Ray looks at the underlying mesh and decides how many strands to put on each face. So for example, you could type something in there. And depending on how many faces were in the underlying mesh, you'll get this number of strands of fur, or grass in this case, for each of those faces. For this example, it is better to keep it at per area, where V-Ray takes a look at the total area of the mesh and distributes fur based off of that calculation. To finish this out, we'll set this value to 3. Then go ahead and clear your region render and click back on the Scene tab and let V-Ray re-render your scene. Just note that with that per area value, you want to keep the number low to avoid crashes with V-Ray for too much complexity. Let's import another proxy. Go ahead and click on the icon for Import Proxy. And in your Assets folder, in the Proxy folder, pick stones.vrmesh and click Open. Orbit, and we'll place these stones along the gravel path here. Now before I start placing them, this VRMesh file has over 350,000 polygons, so it is quite complex. When you bring a proxy in, it's very important that you create instances of it. So for example, I'll click once here, and that's an instance of it. And if I click again, that's another instance of it. This differs from importing different proxies all along the path, where instances of the proxy, or multiple copies of the proxy, are ideal for keeping the file lightweight. Now you can add instances by continuing to click around, or if you hit the Escape button, you can make copies of the proxy using the Move tool. Copies made in this way are also considered instances. Of course, an advantage of the Move tool is not only moving copies, but being able to use the functions for creating arrays, which can help you fill things in much faster. Now go ahead and fill in the rest with these stones, and I've done so here. And notice I've got over 40 instances of this VRMesh. So if you calculate that out, that's well over 13 million polygons. And SketchUp's performance isn't hindered at all. Next, let's cover the material override feature. Open your V-Ray Assets editor and go to the gear icon here for the settings. You'll see here second from the bottom, Material Override. Click to twirl this menu down, and you see that you have a couple of options here that are disabled. Click on this button here to switch on Material Override. You'll see that the override color is set to this kind of grayish white. Let's go ahead and start an interactive render here. Vray replaces all of the materials in your model with the material override color at render time. So using the material override feature can be really helpful during lighting. When you have a neutral color assigned to everything, it makes changes in your lighting easier to preview. Back in the asset editor, you can change the override color, slide the slider to the left to affect the luminance either darker or lighter, or you can change the color by clicking on this swatch here and then choosing another color to your liking. If you'd prefer, you can also override all of these surfaces with a material. Click on the drop-down menu here and pick something from the list, and that material now overrides all of the other surfaces. So whether you use material override to specify a color or a material, this override only happens at render time, and it won't impact the underlying textures and colors that you have applied to your model. Let's talk about the sunlight. By default in SketchUp, your model is always located somewhere in the world. In this case, we're accepting the default location, which is roughly Boulder, Colorado, where the SketchUp team is based. Now, you can turn on the shadows in the Shadows dialog box by clicking on the box there. So these shadows now represent, at this particular time of day, this particular date in the year, if the model is oriented on the lot in the way this one is, the shadows will be cast in this direction. So you can play with the shadow sliders, sliding them right and left to preview the times of day or dates of the year for your scene. Let's go ahead and set the time of day to 13:45 or 1:45 p.m. and the date of the year to December 8th. Then let's go to the asset editor and start an interactive render. Once you've determined your sun position in SketchUp, you'll want to take a look at the sun parameters in the asset editor here. Click on the light icon for the light list. You'll see the sunlight is the only light you have here, and click on the flyout arrow here to get the extra menu. One thing we'll do, the shadows have a pretty crisp edge here. Let's soften those up. The way you do that is through the size multiplier of the sun. So let's go ahead and set that to 4. That increases the size of the light source without affecting the output. So we have a similar output of light, but with a larger size, it softens up the shadows. Next, let's flip down this menu here to see what we have available for the sky. For the sky model, click on this drop down here and you see you have a few options. The default and recommended option is Hasek, so go ahead and click on that one. And you see some small changes to the quality of the lighting coming from the sky model. The last thing we'll look at here is the ground albedo. Albedo is a term for reflectance or optic brightness, and in this case we're talking about the ground having a color that is reflecting back indirect light. Click on the color swatch here, and just so we can really see what's happening, slide your slider to something really prominent like red. And in the background there you can see the effect of the albedo by the red indirect light being cast back up. The blend angle here, you can play around with the slider to see what it does. To the far left, you don't see much bounce. To the far right, you see quite a bit. Really, it ends up being the spread that you get on the gradient from the deepest red back up to the blue of the sky. Let's go ahead and set our blend angle to 6. And lastly, the horizon offset. You can only offset the horizon down. So let's go ahead and highlight this 0 and type 1. To offset the horizon down just a bit, and let's set the albedo color back to something neutral. And then you can fold this window in here and let Vray re-render the scene. Now that you've got sunlight settings that you like, let's take a look at Vray's camera. Click on the Vray asset editor, and under the gear icon here, you'll find the camera menu. Go ahead and click on it once to open it up. Before we take a look at these options, let's go ahead and start an interactive render. In the camera menu option, we're dealing with the camera type of standard. And the two main values we'll take a look at here are exposure value and white balance. For exposure value, If you slide the slider to the right, you'll notice that the number goes smaller. That's because a smaller number produces a brighter image. So sliding the slider to the right, you can think of it as making a brighter image, or if you slide it to the left, making a darker image. Exposure value is a measurement of the camera's sensitivity to the light that's available in your scene. So you can play around with this a bit, and then let's go ahead and set it to 13. Now with the white balance, just as in the world of photography, you might have light temperatures in your scene that affect the appearance of things that should be white. Click on the swatch here, and to counterbalance the warm light, you can set the white balance to something a little bit warmer. Once you've got the standard camera settings dialed in, go ahead and switch off the material override and let Vray render your fully textured image. There's another way to light a daytime scene, and it involves using Vray's dome light. From the toolbar here, go ahead and click on the dome light icon, and then click anywhere in your model once to set the dome light. No matter where you place the dome light, the lighting result will be the same. Let's talk about what a dome light is, but first we'll open the Vray asset editor and we'll go to the light tab here. We want to disable the sunlight. As you'll see in a moment, the Vray dome light is taking over for it, so click once on the icon next to the sunlight to disable it. And then before we look at anything else, go ahead and click the interactive render button. With the Vray dome light, you're adding a 360-degree panoramic image to the scene, and Vray is using that image to cast light back down into your scene. Because image-based lighting from the dome light is such a popular feature, Vray has included a panoramic image straight out of the box. In the Vray asset editor, make sure you have the dome light selected and click on the flyout menu here. The image is a bit dark, so let's go ahead and adjust the intensity of the light being cast from the image. I'll put that at 3. Also, as you can see, there's an appearance of sunlight coming from somewhere, and because I know that there's a visible sun in the sky in this image, it will matter what the rotation of the 360-degree panorama is, as changing the rotation would be the same as moving the position of the sun in the sky. To do that, you'll need to click on this checkered icon next to the color texture HDR and drop down the UVW menu item. You'll notice here that it says horizontal rotation, so you can play around with different horizontal rotations for the image. I happen to know that 160 degrees will look nice, so I'll do that. And then I'll fold that menu up. Note too here, I mentioned that the dome light came pre-configured with a file. If you were to want to add your own 360-degree panorama, you could click on the File menu option here and find that on your desktop. But for this example, we'll go ahead and use the default. Now that I'm done rotating the image, I'll click the back button to get back to this main menu here. And now that we've adjusted the lighting, we'll want to go back over to the camera settings and adjust the white balance. In this case, backing off the warm hues just a bit. Then I'll close all this stuff down and let Vray render the image. Let's take a look at turning our daytime render into a nighttime one. Let's go over to the Vray asset editor, and before we get set up for nighttime, let's go to the gear icon and switch on material override. This will make our lighting changes faster to preview. Then let's go ahead and click on the interactive render. Back over in the Vray asset editor, click on the light bulb tab, click on the dome light, and let's twirl out these settings. The first thing we can do to darken this image down and make it more of a nighttime quality lighting is take the intensity down. Now you could slide it to take a look at what it does, but I happen to know that if you just switch this down to 0.2, you're going to have a fairly good starting point for nighttime lighting. One more thing, to get rid of the casted shadows, we're just going to turn the rotation of the image. So click on the checkered icon, and then under the UVW menu, let's reset that horizontal rotation back to 0 degrees. Once we've done that, we can click back and we can see the image is much darker. Now let's set up some artificial lights in our model. I'm going to move the frame buffer off the window here and close the asset editor. And we'll use the light toolbar to add a series of lights inside the house, outside the house, and in the carport here. So first, we're going to add 6 sphere lights to the inside of the house. To do that, I'll get a top-down view and switch to wireframe so that I can see inside. Go ahead then and click on the sphere light icon and add 4 sphere lights to the ground floor. I'll select them all and move them up off the ground plane. I want to add 2 more sphere lights to the top level, so I'll just make a copy of these. I'll turn back on my textures, and I want to put a spotlight here in the carport. I'll click on the icon here for spotlight, and then place one. And then I'll add some IES lights to the front of the house here. So I'll click on that icon, and then choose the .ies file from the Assets folder, and then I'll make some copies of it. And then lastly, we'll zoom back out, and let's add some sphere lights to the yard lamps. And then when you're all done, go ahead and click on the original scene tab to return back to that camera view. I'll go ahead and move the frame buffer back over. And you can see here that the lights are beginning to illuminate the scene both inside and out. Let's change some parameters about these lights. Open up the Vray Asset Editor. Make sure you're on the Lights tab, and you should see a list of all the lights you've just added. Let's start by changing the sphere light that's on the inside, or the 6 of them together. We'll change the intensity. You can play around with this number. I know 800 should work pretty well. And we'll also change the color temperature. So I'll try to dial this into something a little warmer. Also, we don't want to actually see the spheres as if they are light fixtures. We just want them to cast the light inside. So under the Options tab here, let's check the box for invisible. Next, let's try the IES light. To change the intensity here, let's check this box on to activate it. And then again, you can play with the value. I'm going to set it to 12,000. Also, warm up the color temperature. Then this sphere light for the yard lamp. Again, warm up the temperature. And I'll set this one to 300. Now last is the spotlight. I'll show you something here. In the rendering, you can see the spotlight, and the shadows here in the light and dark is really got a crisp edge to it, really harsh edge that we want to soften up. So in the spotlight, first again we'll warm up the temperature. But how we'll deal with that crisp edge, here at the cone angle, we'll set that to 0.5, and the penumbra angle we'll dial up to 1. And you'll see here that really softens that up. You can continue to play with the different settings until you see a lighting result that you like here in your rendering. And once you do, go ahead and go over to the settings, and let's switch off material override, and let Vray re-render the image with all of the textures applied. Let's take a look at the Vray lens effects. You should already have a render going. If not, you'll need to do that. And once the render is at a sufficient place, you can click Stop in the Vray frame buffer, and at the bottom right of this toolbar, click on the Open Lens Effect settings. Vray's lens effect is a plugin for affecting bloom and glare on the rendered kernel. That means that it's super fast to add bloom or glare that then gets applied down to the image. Let's start with the bloom effect. Check the box to turn it on. Under Mode, if you flip this menu down, this specifies whether the filter will be applied to the image, the underlying RGB image, just the render element, or both. We'll leave it at image for now. Control the appearance of the bloom effect through the weight, size, and shape sliders. The weight is a percentage of the filter versus the underlying image, so sliding it to the right would produce a stronger result. The size is a percentage of the size of the filter relative to the underlying resolution or size of the image. And the shape is going to affect the fall off. So increasing this slider will produce less fall off versus sliding it back to the left. You can play around with all of the sliders to get a feel for how they work and get something that you like. Next, let's turn on the glare effect. There are three ways to generate the glare effect. Under this type dropdown, from image will generate the filter kernel from the RGB image. Whereas if you switch it to from render camera, it will take the camera that rendered the image and generate the filter kernel from its settings. Let's flip it down to the third option though and pick glare type from camera parameters. This will enable the camera parameters section down here. Before we get down there, the mode, weight, and size are similar to the bloom effect in that you can choose from which kind of mode and then adjust the sliders to your taste. Down in the camera parameters, there are three settings that will help us determine what the glare looks like. The F number controls the aperture on the camera, so higher numbers will produce a smaller aperture or a stronger glare effect. I'm going to switch this back down to 6. The blades will control the number of rays that the glare effect produces. You can play around with this to see, but I'll set that value to 3. And the blade rotation will rotate those blades. I'm going to set that to 7 degrees. Go ahead and play around with the settings of all of the effects to get something in the end that you like best.